Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Machanei Ra Online Smicha. In Torah, there's something about every topic in the world, even something which is seems to be far-fetched. Obviously, since the world was created from the Torah, Torah has to have an opinion or a saying about that item. So there's a story in the Gemara Maseches Menachos Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, where Flimoi, who this Flimoi was is also interesting history, came over to Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and asked him a question. A person who has two heads, which in English is called a bicephalous, somebody who has two heads, on which head should he put tefillin? So Rebbe looks at him, and Rebbe thought he's playing games with him, and he's fabricating a Baba Maisa, a fairy tale. So Rebbe says to him, either you get out of here and go to exile, or we'll put you in excommunication, we'll put you in a cherem. In other words, the Rebbe was disappointed that he came with this crazy question, as if this never happened. As they're standing there, a person comes to ask a shaila from Rebbe, and he says, I had a firstborn child, which is a b'chor. The b'chor has two heads. So what's the question? He asks from Rebbe, how much does he have? You know, the firstborn child, you have to do a pidyon aben. How much does he have to pay? Does he have to, for a pidyon aben, you usually give 5 slaim, but that's a regular child that has one head. This child that has two heads, does he have to pay any more? Is it enough just to give 5 slaim? From one hand, it's only one body, that's 5 slaim, but it's two heads, maybe 10 slaim. So somebody came along, it says, Ba Zokein Echad, an elderly person came along, and some say that based on Chazal, that wherever it says Ba Zokein Echad, it's Eliyahu HaNavi. Eliyahu HaNavi came along and said, the halacha is, you have to give asara slaim, you have to pay 10 slaim. Not enough, doesn't go on the body, it goes on the head. How do we know that? The Gemara explains, because by pidyon aben there's a pasuk that says chamesha shkalim la gilgoilus. Instead of saying per person, per b'char you give 5 slaim, it said you give per skull, per head. So because the b'char is rated based on the head, this person who min hashamayim has 2 heads, he has to give twice the chamesha shkalim. So here's a story that Rebbe thought never happened, but the point happened, and this is an interesting shak din. Tosfos over there, and again in Menachos Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, Tosfos Dibra Maschel Oikum says there's another story similar to this. There was a very famous story with Shlomo HaMelech, that Ashmedai, who was the king of the Shadim, the king of the witches, the witchcraft, of the magic. He came to Shlomo HaMelech, and he sucked out from under the ground a person who had 2 heads. And that person married a woman, and she gave birth. Some children had 2 heads, and some children had 1 head. Some children looked like the father, the shade, and some children looked like the mother in 1 head. So when the father died and they were fighting over the Yerusha, over the inheritance, the ones who have the 2 heads demanded they want a double portion, because they shouldn't be just counted as 1, they should be counted as 2, because they have 2 heads. So they came to Shlomo HaMelech for a dispute, for a din Torah. Who's right? So in Shita Mekabetzes over there, the Shita Mekabetzes says that Shlomo HaMelech settled this case. We know the very famous stories how Shlomo, with his great wisdom, solved crazy problems. This crazy story, Shlomo HaMelech solved it this way. He took a bag or something, a cloth, and covered over one of the heads of one of the people who had 2 heads. He covered over the head with a cloth, and he poured hot water on the other head, and yet both heads, both mouths started screaming, "Ow!" So Shlomo HaMelech proved that even though they're two heads, they're really the same person, because he pours water over the other head, both heads scream. So that was, and therefore Shlomo HaMelech paskin that in Yerusha they only get one portion, not two. So there is, from the Minchas Elazar, in the Sefer in the Mukei Eirachayim, in page Chav Zayin, he asks a question. Here there's a story of Shlomo HaMelech, and it's Shlomo HaMelech's story and his brilliant solution. Of course, Rebbe knew about this. So if Rebbe knew about this story, how is it that when Flimoy comes to him and asks him a question about a person with two heads, he looks at him as if he's playing games with him? Didn't the Rebbe know that such a thing happens? So the Minchas Elazar gives an answer like this. He says, Rebbe, he knew the story of Shlomo HaMelech, but he thought that story is a case of witchcraft, a case of Ashmedai, who is the Melech HaShedim. Okay, but it's not a common thing. We don't live in the times where there is Shedim, where there's a Kshafim, where there's witchcraft, or where there's magic. So he said, you're asking me a question that's not relevant. However, Flimoy, we know in Hilchas, in Maseches Psachim, Flimoy says that when a person is doing B'dikas Chametz and there's a hole in the wall, he shouldn't go too far into the hole to check if there's chametz there, because you can never know what kind of witchcraft is going on deep in there. In other words, Flimoy held that kshafim, witchcraft, magic, is a thing that didn't totally disappear. It is common to happen, and therefore Flimoy was able to present it, and Rebbe looked at it as if it's a far-fetched story.